them play.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to September's Author Nook. I'm Jordan H. Bartlett, author of Contest of Queens, Queen's Catacombs, and the upcoming Queendom Come, which comes out March 2025. Try saying that 3 times fast. And I'm joined today by the repeat offender, Marcy McCreary, author of The Disappearance of Trudy Solomon, The Murder of Madison Garcia, and we actually did a talk about that one earlier this year, so I'll put a link to that one down below. It's called Murder, She Wrote, our chat with Terry Friedman. And the book we're going to talk about today is The Summer of Love and Death, which came out last month. So welcome, Marcy. Nice to chat with you again.
Thank you for having me back, Jordan. I'm really excited to talk about this book with everyone out there.
So our theme of today's talk is peace, love, and serial killers. So Marcy, tell me a bit about yourself and The Summer of Love and Death.
So my name is Marcy McCreary. I am the author of a series called the Ford Family Mystery Series. The main protagonist is Detective Susan Ford. She's surrounded by her family. Ford Family Mystery Series. I started the novels back in, the first one came out September 2021, The Disappearance of Trudy Solomon, and from there, 2 more books.
Yeah, and this one's very cool because it's all about family. Like we're we're traveling across 2 different generations where the dad has some information on the case that was considered done and dusted back in the Woodstock era, and then Susan's just come into this new case that is looking a lot like this old case, and so there's a lot of flashbacks, there's a lot of kind of intergenerational stuff. It's very, very clever how you've done it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so the inspiration for this novel is sort of the confluence of 3 things. One, my novels take place in the Catskills region of New York, where the old Borscht Belt hotels used to be. And there's so much nostalgia in those areas. And it's also just happens to be where the Woodstock Music Festival took place, which was not in Woodstock, New York. It was in Bethel, New York, Yasgur's Farm. And that's because the people of Woodstock, New York did not want what they thought at the time would be like even 50,000 hippies traipsing in their town. So the organizers were able to secure Yasgur's Farm, thinking there would be 50, maybe a top 75,000 people converge on the town. So I really wanted to sort of bring that nostalgia into, I mean, my books take place there, so it's hard to ignore it. And there was so much happening at that time as well. If you think about that summer, the Apollo 11 moon landing, the Miracle Mets winning the World Series, you had the Vietnam protests. So it felt like there was a lot of fodder there. Now, because it's a series, I really couldn't do a story that was back in time. So the next 2 sort of pieces that inspired me, the novel, was I was actually watching the film adaptation of Murder on the Orient Express. So the original 1974 film adaptation. And it reminded me that a friend had recently told me that there was a stage adaptation of Murder on the Orient Express. And I thought, okay, my book again takes place in the Catskills, which has a lot of summer stock theater. And wouldn't it be kind of, I don't know, interesting if the murder took place at a summer stock theater where they were performing Murder on the Orient Express? So that was sort of the second idea that came to me. And the third was an article that I read in the New Yorker called The Afterlife of a Terrible Crime. And it's about intergenerational trauma from both the victims and the perps point of view, sort of how the trauma of that crime affects both families, those that were the kin of the murder victim and those that were the kin of the murderer. And that was like sort of the third piece that went, okay, I know how I got an idea. I got an idea for how I can use these 3 themes in one story.
I love it. And how you bring it together is so beautiful, especially because I know, well, for me at least, writing timelines is just a gong show. And I have such a hard time keeping it straight. And then you're jumping between 2 time periods, but also you have to carry forward that previous time period where you've got like the kids who were kids back then are now adults, and we need to know what happened to them across that time skip. It's quite a lot going on. And I love what you said about that intergenerational or like cross-generational trauma carrying forward, and how like what happens in the past does affect the future. So we do get that sense of, I mean, it's a Ford family novel, so family is so important. That idea that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree does have a big role. So how does that concept impact Susan? But also, because I love what you said, where it affects the victims and the family of the perpetrator.
Right.
How does it impact our killer or killers without giving away who that is?
Okay. So I think a lot has to do with how your family either lets you down or picks you up. So, if something happens in your family, do you have that support? And it could be external too, even if they, found you, if something terrible happened within your family or to you, is there some sort of intervention to prevent what I sort of use as a metaphor in the book of dominoes falling? Can it be stopped? And so if you look at the three different sets of families that I have, so the Ford family, in the three books, you see sort of the changing dynamics, the switching alliances of the mother, the father, Susan, how they either are at each other's throats or helping each other out. But they might be a slightly dysfunctional family, but Susan begins to see greater dysfunction outside of her own family, which makes us sort of rethink, sort of like, well, maybe I didn't have it that bad. So you have the Ford family and sort of this idea of, is the family there for her? Is the family there for each other? And that's a huge theme, especially in The Summer of Love and Death with, I don't want to give too much away, but what happens with her mother, Susan Ford. But then you also look at the killer's family and the victim's family, and down the line, was there intervention? Could there have been intervention to prevent some of the things that happened as they had children and passed along, maybe genetically, but maybe just the fact that their lives fell apart? How did that impact their children? And so that's sort of what the story is about, sort of, a little bit of nature versus nurture, a little bit of, is genetics and epigenetics at play, or is it really something that if the family as a unit, had some sort of intervention, would all of this never have happened in the first place?
And what I love about how you portrayed that in the novel is that because you have so many different characters who have suffered not similar fate, some of them, like if it's happened to one family, then there's a couple of children who will have suffered the same fate, but a lot of different families just dealing with the trauma of either normal life tragedies or very horrific tragedies. And you do see the difference in character of how they respond to that. Like there's I don't want to give too much away, but like having a couple of children in a family that really went through heck and back, and seeing how each of the children processed that when they had access to the same resources, they probably had similar support systems in their back pocket. So it was very interesting how you were able to weave all of these different ways that people carry forward the sins of the father, or just like the trauma of the past.
I mean, there's one witness that they interview who talks about her trauma. And she brings forth this idea that when her trauma happened, when her mother was murdered in a very vicious way, she had the support of an aunt and an uncle. They helped her seek therapy. So there's this, so sort of bring in other perspectives than just the main families, because I think that this happens to people who find their way out of the hole, and sort of, and how does that happen? And so I really wanted this one witness to sort of explain to them her situation, that there is a way out. There is, it's not easy, but you can, again, you can find your way out of the trauma of whatever happened to the people in your family.
And seeing the importance of connection, even if it is just, Susan Ford eventually does try harder to be a better partner with her new partner. And I'm blanking on his name. What's his name? Sorry?
Jack Tamale.
Yes.
Yes.
The super hunk Jack. And but you just have these moments where you've got almost these two lone wolf stoic characters, and then they slowly start to form connections, but also share the burden of their job and share the burden of their paths with each other and be healthier as individuals because of that.
I'm glad you picked up on that, because I have to say, I rewrote that subplot many, many times. I couldn't quite sort out what I wanted out of their relationship. So when they are first introduced to each other as new detective partners, they misperceive each other. They say things that they take as slights. And so they start off on the wrong foot, and it takes a while for them to find the even footing. They have very different approaches to investigating crime. So that already sets Susan a little bit off kilter with this partner. And then I love the idea of, as they revealed themselves to each other, as they began to find common ground, they became better partners in how they solved the case. Whereas they were sort of were at each other in the beginning and sort of not trying to come up with theories and follow the evidence as a team. They were actually at odds with each other, which was, sort of hurting the investigation. And then they find a way to each other. I think, and again, it took me quite a while to sort out that particular storyline. I'm not sure why, but it just did. I just couldn't figure out I wanted Jack to definitely influence Susan's character arc. I mean, every character around her should be sort of driving her arc. She's the main character, and there has to be both internal and external reasons as to why she changes from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. And I needed Jack to do that. And finally, I got the aha moment of about his sister. I mean, so I don't want to give too much away, but about his sister, his family, right? So his family comes into play too, and how that affects Susan and how that affects their relationship.
Yeah, and it really almost had and I know they're not romantic partners because Susan does have an actual partner who I also love, good old Ray. But it did have a Pride and Prejudice feel to it, like Darcy and Elizabeth, where they're both, well, not so much Mr. Darcy maybe, but Elizabeth at least is acting off of the prejudice she has against Darcy into interpreting his actions. And then you find out like, oh no, he's just very socially awkward and doesn't open up. And it's not that he's snooty or aloof. He just like cannot converse with people, but he'll write you a letter later. And then you'll find out that all the things he did actually make sense if you look at it through that lens rather than that prejudice lens.
Right. And there's a point where he says, I don't even recall these things that you're telling me I did. Right. I mean, because some people they're like, so when they come to that moment and she invites him to come over to her house and meet Ray and sort of have a more casual, you begin to see them, coming together. But it isn't until they begin to share things about their life that they become on even footing. And it's really interesting how readers have told me they really love that relationship. And I can't even begin to tell you how difficult it was to write that part of the novel. Like crazy, right? I mean, you're like, okay. Whereas other things, where the more complex stuff sometimes tends to come a little bit easier. I don't know.
That's so interesting that it was well, and it just goes to show that you really did fine tune it, because that bridging the gap and how kind of the seeking to understand really did help open them both up.
Yeah.
And I love when we get a character's perspective and we know that they're a faulty narrator, maybe in how they're perceiving things. And then we get to see kind of the light being turned on. It's like, oh, it was actually this the whole time. Similarly, in the novel, I really loved how you described all the witnesses, the suspects, in particular, body language while they're being interrogated, also throughout. The body language you described is so descriptive. And I actually had to look up some things as I was reading, because I was like, I'm sure that by her saying his like eye twitched, this is a tell that I'm going to then discover who the murderer was before Susan does. So it's such a rich description, and it really leaves their motives and their reactions in real time up to the reader to interpret as well. So how much research into the psychology of body language went into this novel, if any?
So yeah, I did a fair amount of research, and really what I found out is that it's sort of junk science, because you know, we're very complex beings. Certainly people have tells that experts can pick up on. And certainly, but there are certainly people who are just nervous and anxious, regardless if they're telling the truth or not. So, it's not exactly exact science. And what was really interesting in researching it was that I would see, I think I say it in this novel, somebody would say, let me just find it because I have it right here. So this is Susan is investigating the murder, and she's interrogating Shayna. And so kind of picking up from there. So she asks Shayna a question, okay? Shayna chewed on the question for a bit. Was she tapping her memory or coming up with a lie? There are those in law enforcement who claim they can discern when someone is lying, usually by a tell, a nose scratch, an eye flicker, slight muscle movements. But a skilled liar will keep their tells in check. In my experience, it's what's said or not said that is more telling. Liars tend to hold back or deceive by omission. But even my methodology is far from foolproof. Some liars prefer to embellish, believing a barrage of detail makes their stories more convincing, right? So those are two opposite things that liars can do. They can either hold back or they can just blather on. So I thought that was really interesting. And that these suspects are actors, right? So if anyone can lie or perform, it's going to be these suspects. So no matter how skilled Susan thinks she is, she's like, well, maybe that's a tell. And she does notice that, I think it was Shayna, at one point picks up her hair and picks at the edges, right? Now, my daughter used to do that when I knew she was lying. So I use that as her tell. She goes like this, she starts splitting the ends of her hair or something. And Susan thinks to herself, my daughter used to do that. I'll have to, put that in the back of my head, as when she answered a question, she did that thing. Was that a lie?
I love that you've got your family in the Ford family. It makes
I try to think about how my children fibbed to me. They
yeah.
weren't, I mean, it's like, did they do anything? And I just remember my daughter always with the split ends. And every time she did it, I was like, I don't think I'm getting a straight answer here.
Oh, I love that. And it's actually so great that you have that comment in there, and you show that it really is kind of like the tells or the not tells or the red herrings in the body language, because Susan doesn't often give a straight judgment based on it, and you as the reader are trying to decipher it. You really do feel like, oh, I'm projecting onto what I think this character is feeling, rather than maybe what they're actually feeling based on my interpretation. And it made me think of that reality show Traitors, where it's basically like secret mafia or werewolf, and you have two people who are supposed to like eliminate the rest of the people who are all innocent, and then every day they come together and they have to figure out who is the eliminator or the traitor. And it was oh, I think you would love it, because I know I just became obsessed with the psychology of these real people. They kind of tried to pick as real kind of average Joes as possible, but the introverts got kicked off first.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like in a very obvious way. All the introverts, where they're kind of more reserved and more anxious, they were put under suspicion fastest, and they were kicked off first because they couldn't convince all these extroverts who were like, no, of course I am innocent.
Oh,
that
that
they
is
were
so
innocent.
interesting. That
Yeah.
is interesting. Right. And that just plays into what I just said. Like, you really can't tell because people are just different and they react to things differently. I can sweat and tell the truth. I mean, if I think I'm going to get in trouble either way. And then you have people who are, you know, who are skilled liars and con men, and they get away with, you know, the craziest stuff.
So we jump back and forth across two generations. As I mentioned before, we've got some flashbacks. We've got like people carried forward from the past who are now older, wiser, maybe a little more guilty, who knows. So what is your writing process, and any tips or tricks that you would give to other authors wanting to keep a bunch of timelines straight without them going completely bananas or having one of those big walls with red lines everywhere?
I have no walls, I have no lines, I have no post-it notes. I use pages. That is it. I don't use Scrivener, nothing. But okay, I did when I came to the novel, I had this structure in my head. Remember, I'm thinking nostalgia, you know, that I knew that I was going to go back and forth between 2019 and 1969. So every 2019 chapter ends with a trigger to the 1969 chapters. So Susan discovers something, she has a conversation with her dad, or he discovers something and he remembers something, because the case is 50 years old and they don't have access to all of the files. So something has to trip his memory. And so when they discover something, usually that is the trigger, and that takes you back to 1969. And what's really important when I make that switch, because it happens after every chapter in the first 2/3 of the book. And the reason it doesn't happen in the last third of the book is because the book takes off from there. You know, it's propulsing at a faster pace. So I didn't want to, at that point, they had gathered all the information that they needed by then about what was going on in the 1969 cases that would help them solve this particular current case. So the main idea was that when you bring someone back in time, you are bringing them into a different world. And you have to paint that world really quickly so that your reader gets dropped into it. So everything about it has to change. The style of your writing, the color of your writing. So you want to sort of get that you want to all of a sudden be in sort of a retro mood, retro colors, retro feeling that you were back in 1969, because you've just, done that flashback thing, right? So generally the 1969 chapters start off with a little world building. So I'm not dropping you into dialogue. I'm dropping you into Will's world, Will's point of view. So you see Will Ford as a young detective on his first case. He's young Will. And so even things about him are different, how he perceives things. He's not, worldly. This is his first case. So even his vernacular has to be a little bit different. He's a young guy. And so I understood the structure going in. I kind of had I knew, who the killer was. I actually sort of had that in my mind. What I don't know is sort of how Susan figures it out. I'm a pantser. I just sit down every day. And I think that's for a pantser, I actually do have to write every day. I need consistency because my plots are complex. I have to have a cadence, a rhythm of writing every day, because I don't want to forget. Like you said, it's like you have all these timelines and a lot of characters, and really writing every day helps me keep track of it. I have no other methodology for it. I think the only note I make to myself is I write down all the characters. I write down their age in 1969 and their age in 2019, their birthday. I think I assign them birthdays too, because I think that's really important for me, because I'm jumping back and forth. I want to understand everybody's age at every particular point in time. So I have everybody on a list and their ages in 1969 and their ages in 2019. And that's pretty much it. And then I go.
That is unreal. That is so impressive that you do that. But I do really relate to, like, because I'm a plotter in that I'll put an outline out there and then I'll pants it, because as I'm writing, I'm like, oh, everything changed now, so we'll keep going. But writing every day, it's so key to keep that momentum in the story. So I love that advice, because even if you end up scrapping pieces, or like you say, reworking whole subplots, at least you're getting where your head is at as you're the writer figuring out what's happening, because that's also kind of imitating what the reader is going to be figuring out too.
Exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
and I think some people call it, being a pantser. I like to call it being a discovery writer. I mean,
like
because
that.
because I'm discovering my characters. I'm discovering the plot. I'm discovering, and I'll go back at the end and I'll feather in more clues and red herrings, or take out clues and red herrings that I think are too obvious or really like don't make sense. So it's not like I get to the end and I'm like, it's this like, really well plotted novel. It usually has a lot of mistakes that have to go back and get fixed, but for the most part, the bulk of it is pretty solid. It's not like very arduous for me to go back and sort of add flavor, add subtext, and even take away and even get rid of characters that I kind of feel like are slowing the pace of the story down. Maybe I'll combine two characters into one character. I've done that.
Yeah, especially because you want to keep that momentum up. And I wanted to ask you too, was there something that you included in your novel that you really geek out about?
I think the research that I did on how law enforcement operated at Woodstock. So, there's lots of information online about Woodstock, about the bands and about the crowds and about, the joyous occasion that it was. But there was nothing about law enforcement, like really understanding how all the different pieces of law enforcement worked. And so I think I was griping to somebody how there's not enough information online. And this guy knew an ex-NYPD cop who volunteered to be part of what was called the Peace Force at the festival. And he put me in touch with him. His name is Nick Chiarkis. And we spoke for hours. Then went back and forth an email. I sent him the passages from those particular chapters. And I even like sort of wrote him into the novel a little bit. He's the Sal character, very minor character. And that is how I was totally geeked out on it. That's how I got all my information on so there was the NYPD commissioner got wind of the fact that the organizers had asked Wavy Gravy, who was an artist there, to get his hog farmers, New Mexico hog farmers, to sort of act as a pseudo casual law enforcement entity. And the commissioner of the NYPD was so embarrassed by it. He's like, I'm not having my guys there if you're going to have these hog farmers there. So he pulled out. The NYPD pulled out. And so Wes Pomeroy, who was the head of security for the Woodstock Festival, went to the commissioner behind closed doors, said, look, hey, we really need cops. And I don't want to use the stadies and I don't want to use the locals. I really need NYPD. So so the commissioner allowed NYPD cops to volunteer over the weekend for $50 a day and free food to go up and manage the Woodstock Festival. No guns. They wore red jackets and they were really there to keep the peace. And that's why they were called the Peace Force. The hog farmers were called the Please Force. So because Wavy Gravy went up and said, please do this and please do this and, please be nice and please be kind and please, don't kill anybody. And so you had the Please Force, the Peace Force, and then you had the local and state police out on the roads directing traffic. That was their role. They were not allowed on the festival grounds with guns or in full uniform. Wes Pomeroy believed that would be the way to keep things, as steady as possible. And it worked.
Yeah, no, and it does speak to the capacity for human kindness over bad things. In a big like mob mentality. It was just a very beautiful, beautiful piece that occurred.
So, they weren't expecting 500,000 people.
Mhm.
And they weren't expecting people to show up 2 days before the festival even started. And when that happened, neither the ticket booth and fencing nor the stage were built yet, completed yet. I mean, they were somewhat, but they weren't completed. So at this point, they had to make a choice: stage or ticket and fencing. And they went with stage. That was more important. And so that is why hundreds of thousands of people poured onto the site, because there was no one to take tickets and the fencing wasn't completely built yet. So that decision was probably the better of the two decisions, because you have 500,000 people showing up without tickets, either looking to buy tickets, and that's where you would get anger, right? And there was anger there. I mean, food prices and water prices were being jacked up. There were certainly people there were people there that burnt down. I want to say, I can't remember if it was a booth giving out water or a booth giving out food, because they were overcharging, so there were incidences. There was 2 overdose deaths, and one young man died when a tractor rolled over his sleeping bag one night.
Oh
So
gosh.
yeah, so there were a few tragedies there. I mean, I make mention of them, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, so you're asking what I geeked out about? That's what I geeked out about. I really geeked out about the law enforcement apparatus at Woodstock.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. And then can you read a favorite quote or passage for us?
Okay, yeah. So this is I think this harks back to this idea of intergenerational trauma and the ability to stop it or not stop it. And so Susan and Jack go to see Susan's daughter, Natalie, who happens to be a psychologist. And they want to sort of ask her a little bit about, how trauma can affect families, even families, the descendants of families who were personally affected by the trauma, whatever the trauma was. And Natalie says to Susan and Jack, picture a single domino as a single life event, whereby each life event is connected to something before and something that will happen in the future. But in life, like in dominoes, there are certainly ways to interrupt the flow. People do have the capacity to rise above their circumstances, whether on their own or with professional help, and course correct the trajectory of their future. Unfortunately, in your case, Helen's next moves certainly did not help their situations.
I
So
love
I think
that.
that I like that chapter, that passage. I think sort of that kind of wraps up a little bit about the metaphor of the dominoes and intergenerational trauma. I mean, it goes much deeper than that, but here's a psychologist, sort of giving the layman's sort of spiel to her mom and her mom's detective partner.
Yeah. And it also helps hammer it home for the audience too, because it is a story about that. So we need those kind of reminders of this is what we're talking about, this is what we mean. Yeah, very cool. And I love that the daughter has an intellectual role in the family mystery, because it's just nice to see the different skills that each family member brings to the table. And she's not in law enforcement, but she has a lot to offer in the way of like understanding people.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because she plays a fairly larger role in the disappearance of Trudy Solomon. You hear a lot about Natalie and her kids and Susan's relationship with her daughter and her grandkids. But I don't really have her that present in the Murder of Madison Garcia, and I kind of missed her. So I brought her back in, especially in her role. Like, oh, it just so happens like I made her a psychologist. Oh, goody, because I can use her, right? So like, again, like sometimes when you're writing, you're not even thinking like how you can use a person like 3-4, books down in the series. But then I thought to myself, oh, it's a good thing I made her a psychologist, because I can definitely tap that in future.
Definitely. Yeah, it's like a resource that's just waiting for you to use.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what projects you have coming up?
Yeah, so I am writing a new novel that is not part of the Ford Family Mystery Series. It's called Dirty Water, and it's based in Boston, and it features 4 retired detectives, one of which is dying of cancer. She's been giving a terminal cancer diagnosis, and she enlists the help of her 3 retired detective friends to solve the murder of her sister, who was a police officer who was killed in a convenience store robbery in 1992. So it's set against sort of the backdrop of the music and mob scene of Boston back in the late 80s, early 90s. So again, it's a dual timeline. It's 2024 and 1992, doing it again. And so, yeah, just something really different called Dirty Water.
Perfect. So yeah, I'll put links to your Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and website down below. Thank you so much for our chat today. I know I learned so much. I always love chatting with you because you always have some cool, like, true crime factoid that you've been sitting on for a while.
Yeah, sort of like the sort of the inside scoop behind, so where I get my ideas from. Yeah, but it was great being here, Jordan. I love being on your show. You have the best questions, so it makes it really fun and easy.
Oh, I'm so glad. And you have the best answers. So thanks again so much for our chat. And thank you, lovely listener or watcher, for joining our chat too. If you liked what you heard, please take a minute to rate and follow this podcast or share it with a like-minded friend. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I release new episodes once a month with no set date. So if you subscribe, it means you won't miss anything. And definitely go out and get yourself a copy of The Summer of Love and Death, because it is a groovy ride. However you found your way here, I hope you are well and living magically.
To hear them play.